The title of this game is a little misleading, as it's not exactly a remake of Final Fantasy VII. It's a shiny particle effect packed expanded version of the Midgar section, which was the opening portion, the appetizer to the main game of the original title. It was like 1/10 of the game if you count all the side quests and level grinding it takes to reach level 99, which, come on, you gotta do that right. You gotta get at least one character to level 99. And since the remake took 5 years to develop, I wonder how many releases it will take to complete all of Final Fantasy VII if the game decides to follow the original progression. At this rate, I'll be playing the Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 5 in 2040. Unless I'm dead by then. In which case, I'm sorry I didn't do more with my life than play Final Fantasy games and talk about it on the internet. The Midgar section is one of the game's most memorable areas, and the sci-fi steampunk world building in this section made FF7 stand out from the previous titles that contained a more fantasy-based art direction. Final Fantasy VI actually began this transformation in art design, but it became more fully realized in Final Fantasy VII. I consider the FF7 remake a completely new game. It may use familiar characters and settings, but the level design, combat, magic system, and story all contain varying amounts of difference to the original. In FF7, the dungeons were pretty short by Final Fantasy standards, though in the remake, the dungeons are sometimes stretched out a little too much. There are also some completely new areas that deepen the Avalanche characters, who didn't get a lot of screen time in the original. We get a lot more of Johnny, too.
Bro! Tifa! Damn, is it good to see you guys again?
I told you to stop calling me that.
In Final Fantasy VII, Johnny was a character who you could play through the whole game and not even notice. But there were some funny optional scenes with him throughout. I think the remake nicely expands on the characters and lore, even if some of the dungeons feel like they're being padded out to make the game longer. Whenever the story begins to deviate from the original, these ghosts, or whispers as the game calls them, show up. They're pretty much a plot device that allows the developers to make changes from the original story. And this actually doesn't really bother me. If I want the original story, I can always go back and play the original game. I have it on PS1, PS3, and PS4. Though its rushed translation makes the complete story somewhat hard to fully comprehend even to this day. There are mods for the PC though. After finishing the Final Fantasy VII Remake, I still prefer the original, though it's unfair to even compare them because the remake is only one piece of a larger entity, while Final Fantasy VII is a complete work. By design, the remake ends on a cliffhanger. In theory, following games would pick up with Calm Town, the Chocobo Ranch, Fort Condor, Junon, Costa del Sol, the Gold Saucer, North Coral, Cosmo Canyon, Nibelheim, Rocket Town, Medio Wutai. Who knows how many areas each game will contain? The next big plot point for the main storyline doesn't happen until the City of the Ancients, but this could all change. From a game design perspective, the FF7 remake has a lot in common with Final Fantasy XIII, but it's like a Final Fantasy XIII done right. This actually feels like the logical extension of what was attempted there. However, the FF7 remake is not nearly as linear, featuring multiple opportunities to break from the main progression for side quests. A lot of these side quests can be on the generic side though.
In that case, maybe you could do something about the Doom Rats?
Still, I prefer it over FF13 where there was only one area at the end of the game to hang out in. This is also similar to FF13 in that there is no world map or returning to previous areas. The story does take you back through some of the previous areas to make it feel less linear, even if it's not. The Final Fantasy games were always pretty linear and story-driven anyway. They were never open world games, though they usually did contain a lot of optional in-game content. The linear nature works here because the original Midgar section was so linear and story-driven, featuring several areas that were single-time areas, and some that could be revisited but not until much later in the game. Unlike FF13, there are areas that serve as towns with shops, which were sorely missing there, and you have to heal after every battle again. Micromanagement of hit points, magic points, equipment, and abilities is at the core of any Final Fantasy experience, and the FF7 Remake provided a much better challenge than many of the other games in the series, which I could sleepwalk through. I actually had to pay more attention in battle as well as utilize materia combinations and elemental attacks to beat bosses. The combat revolves around the stagger meter, which was introduced in FF13, though the combat there was still turn-based. Many enemies can't significantly be harmed until they are first staggered. Some types of attacks fill the stagger meter more, and knowing which attacks increase the stagger meter is vital to success. I eventually learned to create shortcut commands for all of my most useful abilities so I wouldn't have to stop the flow of battle. This is a hybrid of action and turn-based RPG, as you can only use abilities, magic, and items once a meter has filled. This meter fills quickly when you are attacking and basically sits still when you're not. There is a battle rhythm you eventually fall into, which involves using regular attacks to fill the meter, then using an ability to build the stagger meter, or using elemental magic if the enemy doesn't seem to be taking damage. Barret or Aerith can be switched to for long-range attacks, and they are your support characters. Cloud and Tifa are your melee fighters. I will say the air combat is very flawed. The hit detection in the air is more dodgy and the camera's jumping up and down. It's better just to use a long-range character to fight enemies in the air. There are no shortage of epic boss fights here that will require these techniques, some of them taking over half an hour and multiple attempts. The combat being as engaging as it was here allowed me to enjoy myself, even at times when the length of a dungeon was bordering on becoming tedious. The magic system, or materia system, works a little differently, as in the original using green or magic materia would allow spells to be cast, but it would also decrease physical stats and increase magic stats. So I never used green materia on a fighter like Cloud. I would fill Cloud up with yellow or command materia for abilities like steel, and purple or support materia to increase his HP. Red or summon materia in the original would bring down your physical stats even more, so I would load it up on a character that I wanted to use magic like Aerith or Barret. Summons are a lot better here, as in the original they were basically like any other spell but with a long animation. Now they are improved and modernized, as the summon fights alongside your party for a short duration, and then leaves with a big spell, and the animation doesn't disrupt the flow of battle. In this game, materia never affects your stats negatively, so there's not as much consideration in that regard. Each character can only have one summon materia, but as many of any other as possible. You no longer get a duplicate materia for maxing out a materia either. I like the way materia works in the original better, though we'll see if future sequels change this up at all. Limit breaks are basically the same. They slowly build as you take damage, and then you can unleash a huge attack. I had 2 for each character by the end of the game. The FF7 Remake has no problem when it comes to characters, as Cloud Strife, Barret Wallace, Tifa Lockhart, and Aerith Gainsborough are some of the best characters the series has ever given us. Let's just look at these characters from a visual standpoint. Cloud's got big hair like Goku, baggy pants, a piece of armor on one shoulder, just his left shoulder, and a really big sword. Of course, we can all tell he's compensating. Barret is a black guy with tattoos and a gun for an arm. I don't think I had ever seen a black character in a game before 1997. This was actually a really big deal. We've also got Cloud's best friend Tifa. She's a monk-class fighter in a black miniskirt and white crop top with suspenders, and she has a huge set of fists. Yeah, fans were upset when Tifa's breasts were smaller in the remake. Good to see gamers are keeping it classy. Our final character is Aerith, or Eris. The original game called her Eris, but that was a mistranslation apparently. She pulls off the brown hiking boots with a long pink dress and red bolero jacket look quite nicely. They do also have interesting backstories and relationships with one another, and they will undergo significant changes as the story progresses. Cloud has a complicated backstory that is spoiler territory, but I'll say that the remake makes it even more clear early on that Cloud's whole motorcycle riding, big sword wielding, only caring about money, cold, uncaring persona is all a mask to disguise his insecurities and fears. He's one of the most interesting protagonists the series has ever had. How does he work as a mercenary in a battle between eco-terrorists and an evil conglomerate that is literally sucking the life out of the planet and also have the time for such perfect hair? Barrett also has great complexity to his character, as he outwardly appears to be a tough guy, but cares most about the health of the planet and his young daughter Marlene. He leads a group called Avalanche who blow up reactors right in the middle of the city. Barrett's intentions are just, though his actions take the lives of the innocent. He and Cloud start off hating each other because Cloud does not care at all about the fate of the planet or anyone except himself, but signs of a bromance are already beginning to show. Cloud can even take Barrett on a date in the original. It's kind of awkward and I love it. Tifa is the link between Barrett and Cloud because she is Cloud's childhood best friend, but also a member of Avalanche. Cloud is not a member of Avalanche. He joined an elite Shinra military group called Soldier and was genetically enhanced, changing the color of his eyes. This is why people call his eyes Mako eyes. Mako is the lifeblood of the planet that the corporation Shinra uses to power Midgar and enhance its soldiers. There have always been clear themes about environmentalism versus industrialism in Final Fantasy VII, as at the start of the game, you're in control of a group who are sacrificing the lives of the innocent in order to stop the Shinra Power Company from destroying the planet through fracking, or however it is they suck the blood out of the earth. Neither side is completely innocent, and I think this setup is pretty great. The members of Avalanche, Biggs, Wedge, and Jesse make decisions that cost people their lives, but they're also concerned with justice and fairness. Biggs helps out at an orphanage. Wedge is also a big softie. He tries to bond with Cloud and gets shut down. Yet they also kill many people because they believe in their cause. Their cause is just, but the means are not. They all have moments where they contemplate the repercussions of their actions, and the remake does a great job of giving more depth to these really minor one-note characters from the original. By the way, Biggs and Wedge are references to minor characters from the original Star Wars, and it is a trope of the Final Fantasy series to name minor characters after them. In the original game, Jessie was a little flirtatious with Cloud, but in the remake, she is begging for it. In the FF7 remake, everyone is thirsty for Cloud. Tifa wants that D. Jessie wants that D. Aerith wants that D. Random NPCs want that D. This guy wants that D. I can't remember his name, so I'll just flash it on the screen here. This is a little bit of wish fulfillment, putting the player in control of a character who everyone wants to hook up with. I did spend way too long trying to decide what Cloud was going to tell Tifa to wear on their date. What do I want my imaginary girlfriend to wear on our virtual date? The biggest question when playing this game is, do you think Cloud should go for Tifa, his childhood friend with a killer rack? Or Aerith, this new girl who's giving him flowers? Or Jessie, the girl next door? If the girl next door was into building pipe bombs. Me personally, I'm an Aerith guy myself. Her intuitive and wise nature means she can see through Cloud's bullshit better than anyone else. She frequently teases Cloud, and I think she understands better that his whole tough guy persona is a ruse he has created as a self-defense mechanism. So Aerith gets my vote. Tifa, if you've been in the friend zone this long, girl, it ain't happening. In the remake, the English voice acting is good enough and brings the characters to life in a way that the original couldn't do, though the dialogue can be a little silly sometimes.
Well, hello! Who's this? Too quick for the eye. You cross him, you die. Now, mind if I cut in? Woo! Splendid! I've been looking for a new dance partner.
This isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's always good to have a little humor, a little levity in a game that deals with heavy subject matter like eco-terrorism and the destruction of the planet. The redone musical score is fantastic. The prelude theme Aerith's theme, and much of the original music is redone and brought to even new heights of epicness. But there is a lot of new music here too, and it sounds more like music out of the modern Final Fantasy games. Though I had issues with Final Fantasy XIII's level design and characters, one thing I can say about that game is that I loved the music, and I love the music here too. Even when it starts to sound like EDM. Especially when it starts to sound like EDM. I get so hyped going into battle here.
It's on now.
The Final Fantasy VII Remake is a mostly enjoyable experience. The graphics look great on the main characters though. A lot of the NPCs are kind of wooden and PS2 looking. There are some muddy background textures too, especially in Chapter 6 here. This just looks hideous. The combat is fast-paced and there's more strategy involved than simple button mashing. It's the meat and potatoes of the gameplay, and once I got into the rhythm of battling, I could easily spend several hours playing without feeling like it was a slog. The level design was mixed, with some areas feeling repetitive or unnecessary, though the gameplay loop of dungeon exploration, boss fight, story section, side quest hangout area, and occasional minigame or action set piece is well balanced and makes for generally good pacing. I played the original Final Fantasy VII as a starry-eyed 13-year-old boy, and I played the remake as a jaded 36-year-old man, so I was probably a little closer to the target demographic when I played the original. I mean, this game is pretty much a power fantasy where everyone wants to jump your bones, and your character flies all over the place like some jacked-up anime superhero. Not to say that adult me didn't have fun with all of this nonsense, but how do I feel about part 1 of the long-awaited Final Fantasy VII Remake? I think it's a good step in the right direction for the series. I would like to see a higher frame rate, some better animations on NPCs, and better side quests that don't involve looking for lost cats.
I'm looking for cats.
Doing squats was fun. Of course, doing squats was fun in the original too. Just because it's so ridiculous.